here this afternoon to introduce our distinguished speaker. Mary Morton is curator and head of the French Paintings Department at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. She received her bachelor's degree from Stanford University in history and her PhD from Brown University, concentrating on 19th and early 20th century European painting. I've just realized that I haven't told you who I am. I'm the Associate Curator for European Art. My name is Melissa Buron. Many of you may already know me, but just in case you don't, now you know who I am as well. Dr. Morton began her curatorial career in the European Art Department at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and spent 5 years as Associate Curator of Paintings at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. A selection of her previous exhibition projects include The Spectacular Art of Jean-Léon Gérôme in 2010, which was a wonderful exhibition that I saw at the Getty, Courbet and the Modern Landscape in 2006, and Paris in the Age of Impressionism, Masterworks from the Musée d'Orsay in 2002. At the National Gallery, she organized the installation of Gauguin, Maker of Myth in 2011, and in January 2012, a reinstallation of the gallery's renowned 19th century collection. She is currently working on an exhibition of the work of Gustave Caillebotte for 2015 and of Hubert Robert for 2016. Mary also wrote the wonderful essay in the exhibition catalog, which accompanies the Intimate Impressionism exhibition. Her recent scholarship on the Mellon family, and in particular, the life and collecting habits of Ailsa Mellon Bruce, informs the topic of the lecture that she'll present this afternoon. I hope you'll all join me in warmly welcoming Mary Morton to the podium.
Thank you, Melissa, for that very nice introduction. And I wanted to start by saying how happy I am to be back in California and to be at this marvelous museum. And I wanted to thank Melissa in particular for orchestrating this extraordinarily gorgeous installation of our pictures from the National Gallery with the input of the Legion's new director, Colin Bailey, who's an old friend, and himself a distinguished scholar in 18th century French painting and in 19th century French painting, in particular the work of Renoir. So he was sort of an impassioned, I think, collaborator on this project. These pictures are touring the Western and non-Western world currently because we are renovating our East Building in Washington. And for me, curatorially, it's been a chance to focus on what is affectionately known as the Small French Collection at the National Gallery. These are paintings that generally hang in a series of smaller galleries in the magnificently sort of epically scaled East Building. And so I've had the chance in sort of coordinating this from Washington to get to know the collection better. I've been at the National Gallery for just a couple of years, but also to get to know two of the crucial patrons of the gallery, Paul Mellon, and possibly the least well-known and understood gallery patron, Ailsa Mellon Bruce. The spaces, as I mentioned, in the East Building are among the most beloved at the National Gallery. The idea is that we have one of the greatest Impressionist and Post-Impressionist collections in the country, and the spectacular large-scale examples of this collection hang in the West Building, which are perfectly proportioned for these pictures. But for the smaller works, they need smaller spaces. And so we created, I wasn't involved, it was in the late 70s, some smaller spaces for these smaller things. They are pictures that Paul Mellon and Ailsa Mellon Bruce bought to live with. To decorate their homes. They had always intended to give them to the nation, but they were buying them to provide sort of daily pleasure. And so the broad appeal of these paintings stems from this sense of intimacy. These are beautiful paintings made for private pleasure, enjoyed at home every day. Now, much has been written about Paul Mellon, whose patronage and devotion to the National Gallery constitutes, let me get back up to my top here, the lifeline. The first images. Paul, whose devotion to the gallery really constitutes the financial, emotional lifeline of the institution through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Paul, who you see there standing next to his father on an ocean liner crossing the Atlantic, was born in 1907. He was raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and sent off to boarding school to Choate in Connecticut, and then to Yale. He was not ultimately terribly interested in his father's businesses, and he fell in love with horses and with the countryside of Northern Virginia. He was an avid writer, a breeder, and ultimately a benefactor. And he was very involved in the gallery, which his father founded as either president or board chair from 1963 through to 1985. And then he really maintained close contact through to his death in 1999. His first wife, Mary Conover Brown, and he had 2 children. She died tragically in 1946 from an asthma attack. 2 years later, he marries the woman who you see him with here in one of the galleries, during one of the gallery's parties, Rachel Lambert Lloyd, otherwise known as Bunny, who was the heiress of the Listerine fortune. And it really was Bunny that got him interested in French pictures. She loved French culture. She loved Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. She was an avid gardener. She loved color, both natural and reconstructed. Paul was one of our nation's really great philanthropists, and like his father, he never put his name on the institutions that he benefited from. That he benefited with his extraordinary generosity. The president of your board the other day, Mrs. Wilsey, who grew up in Washington, D.C., referred to the way that they called the National Gallery when she was growing up as the Mellon Gallery. But of course, it's not the Mellon Gallery, it's the National Gallery. The idea being that others would come to contribute to the gallery if they didn't put their name on it. There's a veritable hagiography on Paul Mellon in the literature. And we've been thinking again, and I'm showing you a picture of, again, Paul and Bunny. This is in the East Building, just next to the fantastic atrium where the Calder Mobile hangs. But we've been thinking a lot about Bunny lately. Bunny Mellon died just about a week and a half ago at the age of 103. And when Paul Mellon died in 1999, he formally gave his collection to the gallery. But he allowed Bunny a lifetime interest in the pictures so that she could continue to live with the pictures she had lived with for decades in their Upperville home. Just last October, November, while still alive, she sent this fantastic painting over to the gallery. This is a Van Gogh landscape from the final weeks and months of Van Gogh's life after he's left the asylum in Saint-Rémy and moved back to northern France. This is just outside of Auvers, where he was being treated by Dr. Gachet and where he could be closer to his brother Theo in Paris. And he's very prolific during these weeks, and he produces pictures like this one, these pure landscapes. This painting had been hanging over the fireplace in Upperville in Bunny's home, actually unframed, just sort of hanging from a wire, but it's in fantastic state. They bought it in 1955 from a New York dealer, and it has been exhibited publicly only once. Since then, in 1966, there was an exhibition at the gallery celebrating an anniversary. So it had been reproduced in the literature in black and white. There are a few mediocre color reproductions, but here it is. We hung it in January, and it's fantastic to have. We found a frame for it. And it's a Van Gogh that is, again, pure in its sort of immersion in the wind and the meadows and the landscape of this gorgeous region of France, which I think, Van Gogh was really struggling to connect with during a particularly tortured moment in his life. So we're thrilled to have this. Paul, just to show you an assortment of pictures that are in the installation that come from Paul's collecting activities, these marvelous self-portraits, artist self-portraits that Paul seemed to have been intrigued by. That wonderful, brooding, sort of romantic painting of Fontaine Latour you see up in the upper left. Just to the right there is Edgar Degas. Below them is Edouard Vuillard, and then the bad boy of all post-impressionist bad boys, Paul Gauguin, there glowering out at you from the right. Paul also bought this portrait of Claude Monet by Renoir, smoking his pipe and reading a book, and then this marvelous Manet portrait of Georges Moore, who was a writer of the day. Now, what I want to do, as Melissa suggested, with most of the talk today, is talk about Ailsa, because she was so extremely important to the National Gallery and to American philanthropy, and because she's so much less known. She was older than Paul by 6 years. And the fact that she is so little known, I think, is due to both the famous Mellon passion for privacy, in her case, and aggressive resistance to recognition for spectacular acts of generosity. Also due to a lifetime of physical, mental, and emotional ill health. Increasingly reclusive in her mature years, Ailsa was averse to the generic practice of collector patrons, which is to add their names to credit lines and galleries, to appear in the society pages and the art press, to attend openings of exhibitions that include their gifts. She did not participate in any of these activities. Regardless, she belongs to the small group of National Gallery founders, her patronage on a par with that of her brother, as well as that of Joseph Widener, Samuel Kress, Lessing Rosenwald, and Chester Dale. Her close working relationship with John Walker, the National Gallery's chief curator from 1939 to 1956 and then director until 1969, resulted in the acquisition of many of the gallery's most celebrated masterpieces. She contributed funding for the construction of I.M. Pei's East Building, as well as for the world-class library and scholars program that it houses, known as CASVA, the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts, as well as the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings that are the core of this exhibition tour. Now, Ailsa was born also in Pittsburgh into an environment of extreme affluence in 1901. And Pittsburgh, of course, is where Andrew Mellon had built a fortune as a venture capitalist with his brother Richard. She was the daughter of Andrew and his much younger bride, Nora McMullen, who was a beautiful English girl who would move to Pittsburgh to set up house with her husband in 1900. And Pittsburgh in 1900, for this young, vivacious British girl, was difficult. It was an industrial town. Andrew was very much a workaholic. He was significantly older than she was. He is recorded by all accounts as having been rather emotionally remote. In his memoir, Paul describes Ailsa as a high-spirited tomboy, full of energy and imagination. She doted on her parents and on her brother, but her intense affections were blunted by her mother's escape from her unhappy marriage. Nora fell in love with a young, sort of caddish captain and ran off with him. Her father, Andrew Mellon, was extraordinarily angry and responded with fierce recrimination, and then proceeded a prolonged divorce battle in which the children were used as sort of sad pawns in this back and forth. The wrenching absence of her mother and her scandalous flight kept the rumor mill running in provincial Pittsburgh, to the detriment of Ailsa's emotional health. Her austere father, by turns affectionate, controlling, dismissive, and coldly condescending, arranged for her to attend Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, where she seems to have been deeply unhappy. She did not attend university, but went with her father to Washington, D.C. when he was appointed Secretary of the Treasury in 1921. During his tenure, from 1921 to 1932, she served as his social hostess, assuming the support role of a government official's wife. Andrew Mellon never did remarry, and she continued in this capacity until his death in 1937. Ailsa gained experience of the art market, working with her father on his increasingly lavish interiors, both in Pittsburgh, on the house at Woodland Road, as well as in his Washington apartment in the McCormick Building, on Massachusetts Avenue and 18th Street, as well as in the embassy residence in London at 14 Prince's Gate during the summer of 1932 when Andrew Mellon was ambassador to the UK. She and her father worked with Charles Carsters at Nerdler's and French & Company in New York, and most notoriously with the dealer impresario Joseph Duveen, building a spectacular collection of old master paintings. Ailsa accompanied her father in perhaps the greatest art deal of the century, the acquisition of 21 masterpieces from the Russian royal collection at the Hermitage in 1930-31. One story that recurs in the Mellon family literature regarding Ailsa's relationship with art and the National Gallery involves Joshua Reynolds' Lady Caroline Howard, that I'm showing you here, which Andrew acquired from Duveen in 1926, and which hung in Ailsa's corner bedroom in the McCormick building the year that she married. Apparently, she loved this charming image of a sweet-looking, well-born girl kneeling to pluck a rose, the fresh tonalities of her complexion alluding to her childish innocence, while her fashionable mantilla and cap look towards a precocious adulthood. Ailsa's response to this image may have been heightened during this most publicly dramatic year of her life, in which she left her father's side to fulfill her destiny as a well-married bride and starred in what amounted to a royal wedding at the National Cathedral. She was then deeply hurt when she learned that her father had included it in the bequest to the National Gallery that Andrew began to organize legally in 1934. Andrew explained to Ailsa that the picture was too important to be enjoyed privately. Paul recalls in one of his oral histories that she was, quote, very, very upset, which in turn left Andrew feeling badly, defending himself to his son for an act his children perceived as irredeemably insensitive. Andrew explained to Paul that the gallery should be felt to be a family project, a gift from all of them to the nation, a spin that made Paul chuckle in this oral history. It was a painful lesson about public versus private pictures, one that Ailsa would not forget. Ailsa married David Bruce in 1926, a charming, bright, blue-blooded Marylander, the last American aristocrat, according to his biography's title. It was an excellent match for Ailsa, and her father and brother were very pleased. The newlyweds moved to Rome, where David took up his post as vice consul for the State Department, the first step in his intended career as a diplomat. Ailsa immediately contracted a strange disease that was never successfully diagnosed. She ran a constant fever, she was drained of energy and in constant pain. After many months, the couple moved back to Washington, but Ailsa suffered bouts of ill health regularly for the rest of her life. She was also perhaps unprepared emotionally and practically for marriage. While Paul may have benefited from his older sister's nurturing protection during the worst years of their parents' divorce, and surely from his extensive work with the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, to whom he had been introduced by his first wife, Mary Conover, Ailsa was, by all accounts, permanently wounded. David and Ailsa increasingly lived apart until David fell in love with another woman and divorced Ailsa in 1945. The loss of their only child, daughter Audrey, in a plane crash in 1967 adds a final note of tragedy to Ailsa's sad story. References to Ailsa in the literature consistently strike this tragic tone. She's generally blamed for her failed marriage, with David Bruce's immaculate nature casting Ailsa's personal failings into relief. In the process of constructing David Bruce as the shining knight of optimism, his biographer, Nelson Langford, villainizes Ailsa as a spoiled, self-absorbed hypochondriac, ignoring the needs of her husband's career. Drawing on Bruce family gossip that Ailsa was frigid, Langford casts her as a, quote, knotted, brooding recluse, whose death was a sad end to a sad life. Andrew's biographer, David Cannadine, continues the duality, writing about the couple, quote, he was brilliant, well-read, outgoing, impeccably mannered, and professionally ambitious. She was self-centered and aloof, intellectually lazy, inadequately educated, and easily bored, as well as inclined to hypochondria. Cannadine is straightforward in his account of Andrew Mellon's only daughter. He writes that she was brought up, quote, with little other purpose than to marry well. Having accomplished this, Her only work in life was to support, as well as to finance, her husband's diplomatic career, to produce children, and to be swayed by aggressive dealers to spend money on pictures. Alas, there seems to be little in the historical literature to defend her. No journals, few letters of substance, or eloquent literary admirers. In his memoir, Reflections in a Silver Spoon, Paul Mellon writes about their childhood together, but Ailsa drops out of the story when they become adults. Paul was close to David Bruce. They'd been friends as schoolboys, and he regretted losing Bruce's partnership on family matters, including the National Gallery. With the divorce, Bruce resigned his seat on the National Gallery board. On the occasion of the opening of galleries at Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh, devoted to her earlier bequest of her decorative art collection in 1976, Paul took the opportunity to perform what he seemed to feel was a necessary makeover of her reputation. He said, "I would like you all to see her through my eyes as a happy child, an attractive young woman, as a concerned wife and mother and grandmother, as well as an intelligent philanthropist and a collector of rare discernment and taste. A dear companion and charming human being," according to Paul. She taught him to love English poetry and Byron in particular. She also loved to ride, which was again Paul's passion. He remarks on her cool placidity and quiet beauty, which often made her seem rather aloof and inaccessible, as well as charmingly enigmatic. In her younger years, she'd been quite active and outgoing, even boisterous. But in Paul's account, things turned with the divorce from David, after which she became shy, more introverted, less active. He counters her reputation for passivity with her record as a trustee of the Avalon Foundation, which she established in 1940. According to Paul, she rarely missed a meeting, and she did her homework diligently. She asked gently probing questions that got to the heart of the matter. She had a keen but subtle sense of humor and a gentle but penetrating irony in her view of people. This public speech is particularly valuable given the dearth of information Paul reveals in his oral histories, in which the subject of Ailsa seems an understandably uncomfortable one for Paul. At several points, the interviewer guides him back to the subject, but Paul resists and moves on. Ailsa's life was clearly difficult. Painful, turbulent childhood, absent mother, emotionally distant father, highly restricted social role, unsuccessful marriage, she wasn't healthy, and perhaps the greatest of human tragedies, the sudden loss of an only child. But the record shows a capacity for joy and profound engagement with her small group of friends at parties where she's recorded as being as amusing as any other guest. She had been an avid traveler. She loved fashion and jewelry. She had great taste. And despite her protestations against the appellation, she was an avid art collector and a serious philanthropist. Through her 30 years of work at the Avalon Foundation, she allocated some $67 million to colleges and universities, medical schools and hospitals, youth programs, community services, churches, cultural and arts organizations. The key to Ailsa's success as an art collector and patron centered on her close, constructive relationship with John Walker, who I'm showing you here to the left. And that's a picture of Paul and John in storage at the gallery. Just a few years younger than Ailsa, Walker had also been born in Pittsburgh. Appointed chief curator in the run-up to the 1941 opening, he began working seriously with Ailsa in the years after the war. He was appointed director in 1956 and continued to work closely with her until 1969, which is the year that Ailsa died and the year that John Walker resigned as director. Over 2 decades, Walker visited Ailsa frequently in New York, where she was living at 2 East 67th Street. They visited dealers, they lunched and dined together, often with Ailsa's companion Louder Greenway. They went out to the opera, and they spent weekends at Ailsa's Long Island estate at Syosset, swimming and reading and chatting. He characterized theirs as a close friendship. The most significant generative moment in Ailsa's patronage of the gallery was the acquisition in 1955 of the Edward Mellon's collection of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings. Edward Mellon was a British-born couturier, making his name in Paris and establishing the largest couture business in the world in the early 1920s. Successful for 30 years, he began collecting art to decorate his apartment on the Quai d'Orsay with an interest in 18th century French paintings. but by the mid-1930s, he was focusing exclusively on Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings, and Renoir in particular. He often dealt directly with artists' families. Many of his vuillards, including the two I'm showing you here, The Yellow Curtain and The Conversation, came straight from the artist's studio after his death in 1940. And these are wonderful pictures, and I think one of the most powerful moments in the installation is that marvelous wall of vuillards, really some of his greatest small, sort of intimate compositions. These two are pictures of the domestic environment that he shared with his mother, who was a seamstress. And so there were always reams of highly patterned fabric everywhere, covering every surface. And he basically makes his art out of that, and these wonderful sort of juxtapositions of flat color and wildly patterned fabric. Not always, but definitely in these two pictures, and specifically the one to the right, with a kind of domestic drama underlying the composition. I just love this little picture on the right called The Conversation, in which he pictures his mother sitting in the chair, and that's his sister back there clutching the black chair in a kind of sort of terrifyingly defensive way. So there's something going on in this sweet little picture, which I think adds to its complexity. He acquired Renoir's Madame Monet and Her Son, which I'm showing you on the left, directly from Monet's second son, Michel, not the son pictured in this painting, as well as a picture that's not in this exhibition tour, Basile and Camille, which is a study for the Déjeuner sur l'herbe that Monet completed. So both these pictures came from the Monet family, both of them absolute milestones in the movement of Impressionism. In particular, the picture on the left, where just after the first Impressionist exhibition in the spring of 1874, so this is in the summer, Monet is living in Argenteuil, and Manet decides that he's going to go visit this young avant-garde painter, Manet, who does not participate in the Impressionist exhibitions. And so he goes to visit Monet, and they start painting together in the backyard, and who should arrive but young Renoir, sort of crashes the party. And Renoir gets all excited that this is going on there in Argenteuil and asks Monet for a canvas and some paints, and he starts to paint the same motif that Manet is painting, which is Monet's wife and son. And Manet sort of famously, at some point, pulls his friend Monet aside and said, "That young Renoir, I know he's your friend, but you have got to tell him he's an awful painter and get him sort of, push him in another direction." Mullineux also bought this picture from the artist's family. This is Barrett Morisot's artist sister at a window, and it came from Morisot's son-in-law, Ernst Ruar. It's a marvelous painting of Morisot's sister, her beloved sister and fellow artist, until she married, and then she moved away, and here Morisot is visiting her. And she's sitting with a fan, and she could very much already be in the family way. But it's a very sort of tender portrait, as much about the relationship between these two young women as it is a sort of positive record of this woman sitting in these beautiful light conditions. Mullineux bought Sisley's marvelous muted Boulevard Eloise, Argenteuil, which you see on the left, which is a painting done in 1872, before the official movement begins, when Sisley is visiting again with Monet, who was really the core of the movement, in Argenteuil. And Seurat's study for the Grand Jatte, he bought both of those from Wildenstein in Paris. The picture at the right, Boudin's Beach at Trouville, he bought through Arthur Tooth & Sons in London. Bonnard's Cab Horse and Two Dogs in the Street he bought from Bernheim Jeune in Paris, and Monet's Ships Riding on the Seine from Alex Reed and Lefebvre in London. Half of the Renoirs came from Ambroise Vollard, and not all of them of the highest quality. Towards the end of Renoir's life, Vollard scooped up all these little dabs that Renoir was painting and sold a lot of them to Anglo collectors. Walker and Finlay visited Mullineux in the fall of 1950, and a few months later, through Ailsa's ex-husband, David Bruce, Molyneux offered to lend the gallery his collection on long-term loan. This is how these things come about often. It took several years to work through the French export licenses. But in March of 1952, the exhibition opened at the National Gallery and continued on to the Museum of Modern Art. Over the spring and summer of 1955, Ailsa and Lauder Greenway met with Molyneux to discuss the acquisition of the collection, with the ultimate repository stipulated as the National Gallery in the deal. Finlay negotiated the deal back in Paris, and in July of that year, 1955, Ailsa paid $950,000 for 73 paintings, many of which you'll see in the exhibition here. One of the greatest paintings in the collection, alas, and one of my personal favorites by Cézanne, I discovered in doing this research, is this landscape of the Pont de Mancy. And it belonged to Molyneux, and it was on the original list of this deal, but it was dropped and sold ultimately to the Louvre at the same moment as a kind of condition for attaining an export license. Finlay felt in the correspondence, you can see that Finlay felt that the National Gallery had other important Cézannes, namely the Dale and the Charles Lozer pictures, and that the Louvre had nothing from this moment of his career. So the picture now hangs in the Musée d'Orsay. It's a fabulous thing. Over the following decade and a half, Ailsa built on the foundation of the Molyneux pictures. She built a collection of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings with a distinct flavor and a consistent level of quality. She was increasingly committed, I think, as she gained confidence in this area, to molding the collection into something with more of her imprint. Working with Sam Saltz and Wildenstein and Carol Carsters at Nördler's, he was the son of Charles Carsters, with whom her father had worked so closely, she acquired 5 paintings by Camille Pissarro. Her early acquisition of a marvelous Pissarro, this Place du Carrousel, bought in 1949, might have set the artist's special appeal for her. This sunlit summer view of the entrance to the Tuileries Gardens, with the Louvre on the left, painted from a rented room on the Rue de Rivoli, was one of the artist's successful series that he created of views of Paris from the late 1890s. In 1965, Ailsa bought Orchard in Bloom, Louveciennes, an early work, painted the year Pissarro was tutoring Cézanne in outdoor painting. This is 1872, so 2 years before the first Impressionist exhibition. It's a square format painting, and it celebrates the freshness of spring, the pastel tones carefully calibrated, while subtly employing the kind of solid compositional structure that Cézanne would focus on across his career. And I'm showing it here alongside her brother Paul's Pissarro from the same year, which he had bought 10 years earlier in New York. And it's just great to have them together in this exhibition. And in preparation for sending these pictures on tour, we had both of these pictures, along with a couple of other ones in the show, cleaned. And so they look literally as if they had just left the artist's easel. And Melissa and Colin have installed them gorgeously and as sort of pendants around a really fresh Sicily. It's one of the powerful moments in the installation. Other instances in which brother and sister shared specific taste likely influenced one another, you see in this area of these 2 Boudin paintings. Boudin was a great passion of Paul Mellon's, and the National Gallery has a huge collection of paintings by the artist that he left to us. He also left some to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. But here you see the beach at Trouville on the left, which belonged to Ailsa, and Paul's beach scene at Trouville on the right. They look, again, fantastic together in the installation. Ailsa bought the Paul Seurat's Grand Jatte on the left, and Paul Mellon bought the Seurat little landscape sketch of Gravelines in 1966, which had been, Ailsa's Seurat had been part of the Molyneux collection, but I think that it inspired Paul to buy quite a few of these marvelous pointillist sketches, which have, like the Van Gogh green wheat fields at Auvers, also been living out in Upperville, and they will be coming over to the gallery in the next couple of months. Dogs, I think both of these American collectors loved dogs personally. And I'm showing you on the left Ailsa Mellon Bruce's King Charles Spaniel, which was bought from Wildenstein in New York in 1958. And then a year later, Paul Mellon buys the marvelous Tama, both of these pictures by Manet, from Sam Salt's in New York. There is evidence that brother and sister also competed over specific pictures. Early in the 1960s, Wildenstein offered Ailsa what would be her most spectacular Impressionist painting, Monet's Artist's Garden at Vetoy. The picture had also been shown to Paul and Bunny Mellon, who loved it, but they were told by Jay Rusuk at Wildenstein that Ailsa had it on reserve. Paul remembers advising the dealer not to share his interest in the painting with Ailsa, which in Paul's view would compel her to buy it. One can imagine that this is precisely what the dealer did to close the sale, making this a telling tale about both sibling competition in the art market and the exploitation of such rivalry by dealers. Ailsa upgraded the group of Molyneux's Renoirs with this fabulous painting, Young Spanish Woman with a Guitar, which she bought in 1962 from Sam Salt's. Renoir's model here wears a richly embroidered bolero jacket, and what Renoir is doing here is playing the glittering warm colors of the player's sleeve against her flesh tones, and the striking red and black of her headgear, the whole of it harmonizing into a kind of musical ode to Spanish exoticism. Ailsa was drawn to the kind of classic Impressionist pictures that celebrate color, sensuality, and leisure. Edgar Degas seemed not to be a favorite of hers, and unlike his Impressionist colleagues, his subject matter could be quite tough. In 1960, Ailsa was offered one of the paintings from Degas' dark visit to his family in New Orleans in 1872 and 73, during which he created so many of his moving pictures of depressed Victorian womanhood. La Garde Malade, which I'm showing you here, pictures a sick nurse waiting on an unseen patient in a tight, obscure hallway. John Walker loved this marvelous gouache, but returned it to Marian Feichenfeld in Zurich, heartbroken that Ailsa didn't want it. And it's odd, thinking about John Walker and his intimacy with Ailsa, that he wouldn't have understood that a picture like this would not have been appealing. But among the richest moments in the Molyneux collection is the group of paintings by Pierre Bonnard and, as I mentioned, Edward Vuillard. Ailsa added only one Vuillard to the 10 acquired to Molyneux, which is the marvelous artist's paint box, for which she paid dearly. Her greatest impact, however, was her Bonnard spree in the 1960s, when, mostly from Wildenstein, she bought great 20th century Bonnards, enhancing the group of 1890s Nabby pictures acquired by Molyneux. And I'm showing you here two of them. The green table set in a garden, stairs in the artist's garden, and spring landscape, the last one not in this exhibition. All of them displaying Bonnard's radical experiments in sumptuous psychedelic color. These are paintings which could transform interiors into bright souvenirs of the lush spring-summer countryside, of flowers and foliage in the sunlight. Ailsa kept most of them in her New York apartment. Some lived with her in her Syosset mansion, some in her Palm Beach home. She also owned 2 houses in Greenwich, so there was plenty of space for an expanding collection. At the same time that Ailsa was building a personal, private collection of French modernism, she was building the gallery's Old Master collection at an extremely ambitious level. The Old Master paintings she acquired were medium to large to very large in scale, and of a public nature, either by artist's intent or by art historical importance. Once acquired, these pictures that I'm about to show you went directly to the gallery. She did not live with them. Among the most spectacular objects that she did fleetingly consider living with was Fragonard's gorgeous confection, Young Girl Reading. In this work, the great 18th century master performs with his brush in candy-colored hues of yellow, pink, mauve, and red, a palette and painterly virtuosity that directly inspired Renoir a century later. Ailsa loved this image of a lovely young woman dressed in a ruff, contemplating a small text gracefully held in one hand. And she paid a record price for an 18th century picture in 1961. The newspapers made much of the $800,000 price tag. And while the sensational nature of the sale might have influenced her decision not to bring it home to her New York apartment, both John Walker and Paul Mellon credit her memory of Reynolds, Lady Caroline Howard, and her father's stern lesson of the difference between public and private pictures for the decision. Some paintings are too important for private delectation. The credit line on the Fragonard reads, quote, "Gift of Mrs. Mellon Bruce in memory of her father, Andrew Mellon." John Walker appreciated her sacrifice and attempted to assuage her sense of loss in an account that he shared with her of the president, John F. Kennedy, coming by to see the picture at the end of 1961. And he wrote in a note to Ailsa, quote, Our candidate, as Paul calls the president, who was certainly Bunny's candidate, came to the gallery to see it and was enraptured. He admitted she was the most enchanting young lady he had ever seen, and he is a very good judge. Given his training and experience with old master paintings and his vision of the future of the National Gallery, John Walker consistently presented to Ailsa for consideration paintings of quality and art historical importance. Many of them, like the Fragonard, involve images of women in contemplative, spiritual, or self-presentational modes. Such is the case with one of my very favorite pictures in the National Gallery's collection, Nicolas de Largelliere's ethereal portrait of Elizabeth Throckmorton, Francisco de Goya's Condessa de Chinchon on the left, Nicolas Poussin's Assumption of the Virgin, Orazio Gentileschi's Lute Player on the left, Ercole de Roberti's Wife of Hasdrubal, and, most spectacularly, Leonardo da Vinci's Ginevra de Benci. These great masterpieces, the Leonardo as the only painting by the master in North America, perhaps the gallery's most famous painting, were paid for through the Ailsa Mellon Bruce Fund, established in October of 1962 to expand the gallery's collection in significant ways. Walker estimated in his oral history that Ailsa spent between $20 and $30 million on paintings for the gallery. Her help was central to the success of the first 25 years of the gallery's life, maintaining the momentum set by Kress, Widener, Rosenwald, and Dale Gifts. In a note to John Walker in 1968, thanking him for the presentation of an album of her gifts to the gallery, she wrote, "It had never occurred to me to be thanked for anything concerning the National Gallery. It has always been my chief interest and pleasure to do for it what I could do." Ailsa's precipitous decline and death in August of 1969 caught people by surprise. While she suffered bouts of ill health across her life, the death of Audrey in 1967 might have further depleted her will. Recently appointed gallery director Carter Brown quickly organized a memorial exhibition of 50 paintings, sculptures, and drawings. The show, which ran for a short 6 weeks, proved a revelation, if brief. In addition to the paintings of women that I've just shown, it included Bartolomé Esteban Murillo's Return of the Prodigal Son, Ailsa's first major Old Master acquisition, which was bought in 1948, Peter Paul Rubens' epically scaled Daniel and the Lion's Den, Claude Lorraine's Judgment of Paris, Jan van der Weyden's St. George and the Dragon, and Giovanni Paolo Panini's St. Peter's. Her gifts included major American paintings, including the Thomas Cole Cycle, Winslow Homer's Right and Left, and Jasper Francis Cropsey's Autumn on the Hudson River. The press release, likely written by Carter Brown himself, said, quote, "Over the years, the fruits of Mrs. Bruce's quiet generosity have taken up their positions around our building according to their period and medium. To see them all together this way for the first time comes as a surprise even to those of us that work here." Ailsa's French Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings were not included in the memorial exhibition, which were still at her death in her homes in New York and Florida. In October of 1968, likely at Ailsa's request, John Walker and curator Perry Cott had made up a list of paintings and works on paper that the gallery wanted from Ailsa's collection, and separate lists of pictures they didn't want. The selections didn't register in Ailsa's will before her death, however, and everything came to the gallery in the end. Due to the grand scale of the West Building galleries, the smaller paintings went right into storage, awaiting more intimate cabinet picture galleries in the planned new East Building, while the more imposing pictures made their way into the West Building. Ailsa had committed $10 million towards the new East Building, matching her brother's grant. She was honored during the opening in 1978 for this extraordinary gift, and Carter Brown decided temporarily to devote the cabinet picture galleries on the ground floor to Ailsa's collection of small pictures that had been in storage. A catalog of the installation was produced, and in the preface, Brown suggests that once the space in the West Building used for behind-the-scenes museum functions was built back into gallery space, Ailsa's small pictures would return to the West Building. This temporary installation in the East Building was titled Small French Paintings from the Bequest of Ailsa Mellon Bruce. The initial installation and the catalog recording it included works rejected by Walker and Cott in 1968, among them 8 small Renoirs, the ones I was referring to before, that Vollard sold towards the end of Renoir's life, from the Molyneux collection. At the same time, Ailsa's significant additions to the Molyneux collection, comprising her most important French modernist paintings, were not moved from the West Building for the East Building installation, and they were not included in the catalog. Although the contents of the cabinet galleries in the East Building has changed to some degree over the past 25 years, the galleries have retained an association with her name. Her singular association with small French paintings has somewhat diminished her much greater role as a founding patron of the gallery. In the end, as with most instances of collection building in the great museums of the United States, Ailsa's achievement was due to a partnership between an art patron of great financial means and enlightened attitude of civic generosity on the one hand, and an art historian and museum professional with a clear vision on the other. One must consider where the gallery would be without the teamwork of John Walker and Ailsa, and how much more they might have accomplished. Walker himself wrote at the end of 1966, less than 3 years before Ailsa's death and his own retirement, quote, "It is difficult to know how to thank you for your generosity to the gallery. Perhaps if I told you that your support has meant more to me than anything else that has occurred in my professional life, this might convey some idea of how much I appreciate what you have done. I hope it gives you satisfaction to know that your father, I feel sure, would be pleased with the first 25 years of the institution he established. You, more than anyone else, have made possible its growth and future development." Thank you very much.